Hello class, my name is Cameron Gutierrez and I'll be leading the discussion this week on George Washington's Washington, Part 4, which includes a small intro, chapters 8 and 9, and an epilogue. My partner Mark will be leading y'all on Slack with the discussion questions, so I look forward to that. But let's get started. The author's intro to Part 4, The Seat of the Continental Empire, starts off with two commencement ceremonies taking place on July 4th of 1828. In the capital, Washington, D.C., John Quincy Adams, the current president, is about to take the ceremonial first scoop of dirt to kick off the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal Project, which, from earlier chapters we know, would have been the fulfillment of George Washington's dream for the city to be this huge trade hub that connects the interior to the coast. But as Adams is about to drive in his shovel, he immediately hits either a stump or a root, and he's unable to get that first scoop of dirt. So what he does is he takes off his jacket, he rolls up his sleeves, and he goes at it another 3 or 4 times. But in the end, he ends up getting that first scoop. And the audience, they love it all. It's kind of like the American perseverance. Meanwhile, in Baltimore, miles away, they're also having a large commencement ceremony. And because they couldn't get the president, what they do is they get Charles Carroll, who is the last living signer of the Declaration of Independence. And the commencement ceremony he's at is for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Company. So railroad, canal. You see where this is going. He's like 90 years old, but he's able to just stick his shovel in and get that first scoop. I think this is going to show that, Baltimore ends up being that big trade hub that Washington wished his city could have been. D.C. has quite a few more obstacles it's going to have to face. Washington, Georgetown, and Alexandria all take out large loans, thinking that making the canal is going to end up being real great for them. Everything's going to turn out all right. But with setbacks and whatnot, it ends up just putting them in way more debt than they can handle. But seeing this at that same time, the national government ends up stepping in for the first time and actually providing financial aid for the development of the capital, which hadn't happened before. This is kind of the new era as we move away from John Quincy Adams and we go into Chapter 8 and the Jacksonian era. This era had two national trends that really changed how people saw the national capital. The first was the rapid expansion of the population and the economy as we were moving westward. We were growing larger. From 1800 to 1840, the population grew. In 1820, Washington became the 9th most populous city in the U.S. It was kind of the only time D.C. has ever been in the top 10. And besides population growth, we also had the debate over slavery was coming up. And, as America's represents freedom and whatnot, the capital should represent freedom, and it can't do that if people there are enslaved. So for the rest of Chapter 8, it's really just going to elaborate on those two national trends. The first of which, westward expansion, is really buffing up the power and the scope of the national government. You see, for like the first 20 years after the Revolutionary War, the government doesn't really have a whole lot of power or influence. It's real small. They're doing things out of Philadelphia. They're still paying back war debts, so they don't have a whole lot of money. They're having trouble taxing. But then we get to like the War of 1812, where we're showing that we're actually strong enough to defend ourselves from outside forces. Now the government's starting to get a bit stronger. Now they've got more money. They start being able to provide loans, funds, charters to people moving out west. The military's penning in the natives, which is making more room for westward expansion, even though it's super icky to think about. And as the nation's growing, so is the legislative branch, because as we get more states, we get more senators, And as we get more people living in those places, we're getting bigger Congress. At that time, Congress didn't have the limits on its size that it does now. So, like I said, this time period is just massive expansion in all on all sectors: economy, population, size of everything. Moving on. So then the second trend that the chapter focuses on is the debate on slavery. And that's not saying that it just popped up during this time period. I mean, it had been around since the founding of the nation, but it really grew into, I guess, huge focus for the nation at this time. Let's see. First, we have the abolitionists in the North and the pro-slavers in the South, and both sides see the national capital as kind of a representation for the whole nation. And the abolitionists don't want to see slaves in the nation's capital the free America's capital. They don't want slave people. But the anti-slavers don't want to see people losing their right to own slaves even in the national capital. So here we see them butting heads, and the national capital being, the battleground for it. Unfortunately for the abolitionists, a bunch of really bloody revolts in Virginia around the 1830s, really, and other states, really, let's see, I guess really douse any kind of anti-slavery feelings that the white population has in, especially the District of Columbia. They're afraid that any free black men are just going to come and burn their house down and kill their whole family. So by the 1830s, the District of Columbia is really not looking to free the slaves anyway. But it's still a big debate at the time. And as we know, 40 years later, 1860s, it's a debate that divides the nation. So moving on to chapter 9, federal intervention, we really start looking into Jackson's presidency and how that affected D.C. And when he's first elected, the residents are kind of scared because they're worried he's going to follow in Jackson and Jefferson's footprints. He's going to go agrarian over urbanization, small federal government over, large states' rights. He campaigns on a spoil system. They're worried that all of Adams' people are going to get kicked out. He's after the American Bank. They're worried that he's going to go after their banks too. And he was kind of famous for disliking federally financed internal improvements. So they're kind of worried that the money's going to dry up. But I mean, fortunately for them, as we're going to see throughout the rest of the chapter, those fears go unrealized, and it's kind of the opposite with Andrew Jackson. So focusing in more on that last fear that the District of Columbia residents had, that Jackson's dislike of federally funded internal improvements was going to really hurt them. First off, he couldn't do anything about the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal Company because that ball had started rolling long before he had been elected president. Unfortunately for the project, as they're getting down to the nitty-gritty and surveying how much it's going to cost, the number they come up with is $22.3 million, which is about $8 million more than they had for it. Luckily for them, because the ball had been rolling and so many people had so much money at stake for this project, they went back and they surveyed again, and what they came back with was $4.5 million. And so the project was able to go ahead. There was also the paving of Pennsylvania Avenue, which was going to cost a whole lot of money. Taking care of all the avenues in the capital was costing a lot of money. Really, the Washington, Alexandria, Georgetown, they were in debt still over the canal, their loans. The creditors were starting to come in here. And I mean, no one wanted to see the city that's supposed to represent the nation being controlled by, the Dutch creditors. So what ends up happening is that, the U.S. gets behind their city, Washington, D.C., and the federal government starts providing some aid. So to finish off the chapter, we get 3 projects that show that Andrew Jackson and the federal government are willing to go beyond just saving the District of Columbia from bankruptcy and really start moving towards making the national capital look like a national capital and be as as George Washington and Elephant had wanted it to be, and that's just kind of representative of what the nation was headed for. And those three projects are the Treasury Building, the Patent Office, and the General Post Office. Now, we all know the Treasury Building from the back of a $10 bill, so here's a picture of that. There's the Patent Office, and that's the U.S. Post Office. The Treasury Building is still in use. The Patent Office and the Post Office have all kind of gotten new purposes over time. And this really shows that Jackson and the national government are really trying to make D.C. into that shining city on a hill that L'Enfant and Washington wanted it to be. But then moving on to the epilogue and wrapping up this kind of long video, and I apologize for its length. The author goes back and we look at Washington, Alexandria, and Georgetown. And while Washington had really profited from all these buildings and whatnot, Alexandria and Georgetown really didn't get as much profit as Washington was seeing. So Alexandria ends up retroceding from D.C. They go back to Virginia. And while Georgetown isn't able to get the votes to retrocede, they end up attracting some businesses and doing all right. They don't go bankrupt, but they don't do as well as Washington, D.C. does. The people living in Washington are still trying to keep it culturally relevant, so they bring in the Smithsonian. They have the first National Fair. Unfortunately, around this time of Jackson, a lot of the first Washingtonians, the ones that really brought in other people, the ones that made this, district as great as it could be, they believed in it, they brought people, they start dying. So we start losing a lot of the big names that had been helping DC get built, like Robert Brent, William Thornton, Marcia Byrne Van Ness, who had been in charge of the orphanage, Harrison Smith, his wife, Margaret Bernard Smith, who had been writers. They all start passing away, and the next generation of Washingtonians got to take on the torch. And unfortunately, they have a much harder time doing that than the original Washingtonians because they don't have as much influence in Congress. Congress is just blown up. It's doubled in size. They just really can't. They don't have the leverage that the original Washingtonians had. They don't have the clout that they had. Then the Civil War comes on, and this is still shows that the capital is kind of representative of the nation. You have Lincoln making sure that the capital is protected from Virginia, that's just over the river. They just can't let the rebels take it over, and that's kind of where the book finishes. So Mark's going to take care of the questions on Slack. I really enjoyed this book. I hope y'all did too. I'll see y'all around. Thanks.